What is the tolerance for non-performing loans in Brazil with Itau? I noticed that your NPL is something like 6 to 8% at the moment.
Yeah.
In Asia, the Asian banks that went through the 1997 crisis have been able to bring their NPLs down to below 2% on average. And sometimes even the banks that are not well run can generally keep it below 2%. What is the tolerance for non-performing loans in an environment like?
In Brazil, we have higher losses for many reasons. So the level of NPLs, even in good times, are much higher than the ones you can see comparing to other emerging
Is it
markets.
because of the culture of the corporates in Latin America?
No, we have more probably on the overall balance. We have more credit consumer.
Consumer credit, basically.
Consumer credit, basically, much more. We have very low level of mortgages. In Brazil, we have only 3% of the loans are mortgages, so it's a very low level of mortgages in Brazil. And consumer credits has much higher level of delinquency. But the banks, in general, I mean, since this is something that has been in the market for many, many years, the banks price the loans accordingly to the level of losses which are high. This means higher spreads, and the banks also have very high level of provisions in addition to the ones that are, as we say, the minimum requirement. We are allowed in Brazil to have buffer provisions, and those provisions probably will be somehow used to
right back
moment,
into Now, in terms of the infrastructure of your bank, is there good infrastructure for credit review, like credit bureaus in Brazil?
Yeah, this is a problem in Brazil. This is one of the reasons why delinquency is higher in Brazil. In Brazil, we have not positive information about clients. Very recently, 2 weeks ago, this is very, very new in Brazil, the Congress has approved a law that will allow us to have positive access.
You do already have a credit bureau system, except
only for negative.
For negative.
Yes, only for negative. We don't have for positive. And this probably will help to bring down the level of delinquency in Brazil.
Right. How compliant are you with Basel II?
We are pretty much compliant to Basel II.
Standardized?
Yes, we are coming to very close with a program that we have established to comply fully with Basel II next year.
Are you aspiring to be advanced
Yes.
IRB?
Yes.
And what sort of time frame do you have in mind?
Probably 2010, 11. Depends on the central bank in Brazil. We still have to do some regulation, but we will be the front runner in Brazil to be.
What is your sense as a practitioner in a Latin American environment in terms of the framework for Basel II right now? Is pro-cyclicality of the model a disadvantage?
We have always, in our case as a bank, always have had excess provisions for the bad times. In the past, central bank did not like this because they want us to be exactly limited to what the regulation asks us to do. But over time, we proved them that by being over-provisioned in good times, this would be much better for the bank during the bad times. This was very clear during the period of the crisis in the banking system in Brazil in the 90s, when the banks that were over-provisioned came out very well, and the banks that were very low provisioned, basically they had a lot of problems, and many of them bankrupted and created a lot of problems in the system.
But that's assuming the cost of capital is not prohibitive.
Yes, but I mean, market conditions leads the banks to a given situation. In Latin America, the banks that have survived, given the high volatility that we have had during the last 20 years, were banks that really had higher levels of provisions and higher level of capitalization. So this became winning formula for banks in Latin America.
Right. Now, the IIF has a couple of initiatives, one on market reform, another on regulatory reform. And I think that they published a paper last year in June or July, putting out best practices in terms of market reform of commercial banks.
In our case, in the Banco Itau Unibanco, we have been implementing, we have a program to implement all the recommendations that are there.
And how long will that take? And
I would say that to start with, we had probably very close to 78% already implemented. So we are talking about the remaining 30%. And of this remaining 30%, many of those are already implemented, and some of them are on the way to be implemented. But probably by the end of this year or something like that, we will have everything implemented.
What's the relationship between the commercial banking industry in Brazil with government policy, both fiscal and monetary?
There's no interference. Private banks in Brazil are, does not suffer any kind of pressure, or the level of influence is very, very, very low. But in the case of Brazil, we have federal banks, which means that some banks are owned by the federal government. And those banks are very big. Altogether, the three major federal banks, they have probably 35 to 40% of the market on loans. So when the government wants to interfere in the market in some way, they use the federal banks to do it, okay? To lead the markets to any kind of action that they want to have done.
Right, but around the world, with so much fiscal stimulus being poured into the system, there is this fear of inflation, and I think that countries.
Not in case of Brazil. I mean, the monetary stimulus was very low. I mean, in terms of reducing
interest rates.
Reducing interest rates, but it's still very high. In Brazil, it's over 10% still. Probably will come down to a level of 9% still this year, but it's still very high. And reserves requirement, although has been reduced recently during this period of crisis, it's still higher than any other place in the world. So the level of stimulus was not that big in the case of Brazil.
But having said that, then I would imagine that really the government's, one of the government's tools is really locking and unlocking reserve requirements in the commercial banking sector.
The case of Brazil, I mean, we have monetary policy is based on on inflation targets. Okay, so they are very keen in order to be inside the band that they define as target, and they have been doing this for more than 5 years. And this was key in the case of Brazil to succeed against inflation. So all the monetary policy in Brazil is focused on inflation. Brazil had inflation of more than 3,000% in the early 90s, but in the last 10 years we have had inflations below 10%.
Right, and what is the worry today?
No, there's no worry about economy overheating. I think that central bank has doing a very good job in terms of balancing correctly the monetary policy, and I would not say we don't have any kind of pressure on terms of overheating the economy. Central bank has been very conservative in Brazil in general.
What would you like to see taking place on the global front, which is of benefit to Brazil and to your bank?
Well, I think all the countries would benefit of a more stable financial system. Yeah, stability would be great for everybody. I think volatility is always very bad, especially in such levels that we enjoyed those months behind us. So I believe that the stability that we are looking for would be good for everybody. I think this is the main game.